Hello and welcome to Connected. 大家好，欢迎收看 Connected. Now, if that last bit threw you off, well then maybe today's episode might be just for you. No, we won't be teaching you Mandarin, but we will be talking about whether or not you should start learning it. Can Mandarin ever match or even replace English as the top international language? And can it become lingua franca, which means a language of international communication for people who did not grow up speaking it? So to help answer these questions, we connect to Aga Walulik in Warsaw and Li Yanyi, who is in Taipei. Welcome, both of you. Aga, you're a sinologist. Now, can you tell us what that means?
Well, that's basically just a fancy name for a person who studied Chinese language and culture.
Yanyi, tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you are defending or have just defended your PhD at Cambridge University. Tell us how that's connected to this topic.
Yes, so I recently successfully defended my thesis at the University of Cambridge, where I looked at how learners can develop strategies to learn a linguistically distant language. And because I'm Taiwanese, my specific focus was on Mandarin learners.
So what's interesting and what connects, obviously, you both to the show today is the fact that you two chose to focus either your studies or your career on Mandarin. And I'll start with you, Aga. Why Mandarin?
I've been asked this question ever since I started. The first time I came into contact with Chinese culture, basically, was when I was really little and I got this book of Chinese fairy tales that was translated by one of then most important Chinese scholars from Poland. So it's like short stories from the Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, and I discovered this whole world of fantasy that was very unlike what I knew from the European culture. And I guess it kind of stuck in my mind somewhere and germinated till I was thinking about my university plans. And because I've always enjoyed learning languages, I thought this could be interesting. This could be an interesting culture to learn about.
So, Aga, that's definitely something I want to talk about as we go further into this program. But first, Yanyi, let's talk about this whole idea of linguistically distant language and the fact that if you compare English and Chinese, particularly when you're talking about the Western sphere, where a lot of the kind of the language for international business, diplomacy, etc., how linguistically distant is Chinese from that sphere when using a language to internationally communicate?
Linguistic distance is quite hard to define technically, but most of it is subjective. And if we look at, the structure of Mandarin, it's a tonal language. It's not alphabetic. It's a logographic language. And these components themselves already make Chinese quite distant from most other mainstream languages in the world. So that makes, in my opinion, it makes Chinese very hard to become a lingua franca.
Right. So until we all learn to speak one single language, we will be forced to rely on translators, interpreters. But how do you translate something that is specific to a culture, which Aga had touched on, or relies on quirks unique to a language or a place? So to depict this a bit further, we were recently at the Taipei International Book Exhibition, which showcases both Taiwanese and foreign literature. This year's guest country was Poland. It's a country far removed from Mandarin, going back to our linguistic distancing, both geographically and linguistically. But the book, which is Dancing Bears, which is Polish, has become a runaway success here. And we spoke to the author Witold Schabowski and asked him why he thinks his book on Central and Eastern Europe's political transformation has become an unexpected hit in Taiwan.
I must say I was very surprised how my books gained popularity in Taiwan. When I wrote Dancing Bears, I thought it's a very local story, but the strength of the metaphor used in that book appeared, and somehow it became popular and important to people in Taiwan, and I can only say that I'm very happy about that. I think what makes this book resonating so well here in Taiwan are the similarities between Poland and the, let's call it, ex-communist camp, and the situation of Taiwan. We are both living in a shadow of a big empire of a country that doesn't accept your independence and who's denying your existence. I think Chinese as the Mandarinian actually, as the most spoken language in the world, would be a nice lingua franca. The only problem with Mandarinian is it's so hard to learn. I've been here for a while. All I can say is ni hao, xi xie, and it's quite hard to get farther than that.
So Aga, let me begin with you. You've done translated into Chinese, is that right? Polish to Chinese or Chinese to Polish?
Chinese to Polish. I also translate from English to Polish. And with English, I feel comfortable enough that I would, given the chance, I would endeavor to translate from Polish into English. I have done this and I feel quite confident in my skill here. But when it comes to Chinese, even though my degree is in Chinese, I have only translated from Chinese, from Mandarin into Polish or into English. And I don't think I would risk doing it the other way around.
What is the difficulty, aside from perhaps proficiency, but in grasping, translating from one complex language to another, and particularly with Chinese, like expressing your thoughts from that part of the world into a language like Chinese?
The cultural differences are a major issue. As you said, like fluency is one thing, so sometimes you have to use dictionaries and look things up a little bit more than in a language that's a little bit closer to your own. But apart from that, you're also translating a culture from a culture. So, for example, when I'm translating from English, a culture that is quite similar to Polish culture, usually I don't have to deal with challenges like this. Like sometimes there will be maybe a brand mentioned that is unknown in Poland. So then maybe instead of giving the name of the brand, I will just say something generic, like they were eating cereals or they were eating cookies instead of they were eating Oreos or something like this. But it's fairly small. It's very little things, and the general background, like if you allude to something in history, most people will be able to understand it, and if not, they will be able to get that it's an allusion, and they will have the resources to just go online and look it up. So when I'm translating from English, I try to avoid giving footnotes because I think it's quite patronizing to the reader. But when I'm translating from Mandarin, there are so many things. There will be allusions, for example, to Buddhist culture or to traditional, like Chinese literature or historical references. And that all of these are things that are fairly unknown in Poland. So you have to give the reader a fighting chance at understanding the background.
The whole idea of context, the whole idea of familiarity with history, characters, or culture. And this is, Yanni, this is what I want to, and it's one of the points that Shabuowski had brought up, about saying that his theme resonated with Taiwan, and therefore people in Taiwan were interested in his book. But, in a way that also links languages. My interest in trying to learn a language, if I can understand the context. How much does culture and similarities in context or background and shared experiences go into this in wanting to learn a language and therefore it being a contender for lingua franca?
I love that question, Divya. I just really love that question. I think that language and culture is just so intertwined that when it comes to motivation to learn a new language, you can't really discard culture entirely. If I could, I would give an example from the United Kingdom. If you look at the secondary schools in the UK, they offer foreign language courses mainly in languages such as French, Spanish, German, and maybe Italian. You very rarely see schools that offer courses in Chinese or Arabic. And it just goes to say that ideology plays a big part in deciding what kind of languages people want to learn in school. It's like you can see from the United Kingdom that people are still very much deeply buried in the comfortable bosom of Western Europe. It's quite hard for people to take that step outwards. And and be able to embrace a culture that's as starkly different as Mandarin Chinese. So I think that this is also another barrier when it comes to asking whether or not Chinese can be a lingua franca. If we can see what happened in the world after COVID, there was so much like xenophobia going on out there. There was so much hate towards Chinese-speaking people, and sometimes I seriously question myself: do I really see these people learning Chinese to a fluent level? It's really hard for me to imagine that, there's just still a lot of miscommunication, still a lot of misunderstanding with regard to culture between the East and the West. So I would say that's quite a big barrier, and culture does have pretty much everything to do with languages.
And Aga, if I can get you to react to that.
What Yeni said, that learning a language and the factors that decide about people choosing to learn a specific language have much more to do with cultural domination, sometimes political or maybe business opportunities. But in my experience, the people who go into learning Chinese just because they think, China is going to be the next major power, so it's good to know Chinese, those people drop off fairly quickly. They don't have the drive. Chinese is that, as with any language, there has to be something in it for you. Like something that gives you personal satisfaction, that draws you in. For me, the reason why I speak English is because I loved English literature and I wanted to read it in the original. Chinese had its moment. It used to be a lingua franca in Asia throughout centuries. For many centuries, all of East Asian culture is affected by Chinese language and culture. So clearly, it is possible for Chinese, but that's also because China was a huge cultural empire.
But I want to put some figures and statistics to what you're saying and what you're talking about right now. Now, Schabowski called Mandarin the most spoken language in the world, but is that really the case? It turns out that numbers differ greatly depending on whether you count non-native speakers. So looking at only native speakers, though, Mandarin is clearly ahead, and even despite the ongoing debates on whether certain variations are considered dialects. So now, once you include non-native speakers, an entirely different picture emerges. And with these numbers alone, English shoots well ahead, leaving all of its competition in the dust. So going back to Yanyi, if you look at, just a hard look at these numbers, is there potential for Mandarin to become lingua franca, given that, the sheer number of people that actually speak it?
Divya, I really think that sometimes we can't only rely on numbers to tell us the answers, because, yeah, sure, there are a lot of native Mandarin speakers in the world, but a lot of them don't have much role to play in the global stage. And also, when it comes to the question of lingua franca, we first have to ask ourselves, what makes a language a lingua franca in the first place? What are the circumstances that lead a language to become a lingua franca? If we look at English, there was colonization, there was the rise and development of the internet, which, a lot of which happened in the US. And there was also the fact that English is ultimately still an alphabetic language. It's not a very easy language to learn, but ultimately English is still the kind of language that if you try hard enough, you can master it in your home country. You don't actually have to go overseas to be able to be an English language speaker. But looking at the case of Mandarin, we don't really think that these factors can translate so easily, because just the language itself, it's highly opaque. If you look online, there are people who tell you that you can master Mandarin in 3 to 5 years, which in my opinion, it's not true, because there's so much nuance that goes into Mandarin that unless you're really immersed in the culture, it's really hard for you to become truly literate in this language. And also, when it comes to, let's say, media, we know that China blocks a lot of the major Western media sites. And this blockage, I would say this is a barrier for people to communicate interculturally. And for people to learn your language, you sort of have to open your media for other people to access. Because we can't really just rely on textbooks and worksheets to be fluent in language. We also need authentic access to that target language in order to be fluent. So I would say that media plays a role in a lot of this, and I feel that with media going on as it is, it's really hard for people outside of China to learn Chinese authentically. So I feel that it's quite hard for Mandarin to become a lingua franca, also because, yes, I mean, China does have economic influence in certain countries, but it doesn't have a cultural influence in those countries, and as I mentioned just now, culture and language.
Okay, so going off that idea, I want you to listen to this, and then I'll come back to you. At the Taipei Book Fair Expo, we also spoke to Beiling. He's a Chinese dissident, poet, and publisher, and we asked him his thoughts on the international roles of English and Mandarin.
After Second World War, English became most internationally, like a communications language. So Chinese, because China is communist regime, they do not open the door. So language only focused in Chinese area. I little bit worry because China have a branch, big money. China, they do Confucius Institute. In Taiwan, one focus of copy this model, very difficult. I think Taiwan need like good institute or 70s institute like Spanish. They just spend time in some most important city. I think so in future, Chinese should be more and more important, like a second international language. And this future means after 10 years. Because now so many Chinese, for economic reason, political reason, they became new immigrants.
Well, you can watch the full version of our interviews with Witold Szabłowski and Beiling on our YouTube channel. Let me take this to you, Aga, the whole idea of what Yanyi was talking about and what we heard there of having a closed society. How difficult does that make you how much does that stop you from drawing you to a language and immersing yourself in it?
I agree with every single word that Yanyi said. And I would like to add to this that in order for people to want to learn a language, like on a massive scale, on a mass scale, this culture needs to make itself welcoming. As a foreign speaker of Mandarin, I can't tell you how many times I have been told, like if I question something, if I was wondering about something, the reply that I heard from Chinese native speakers was, 你们外国人，你们不懂中国文化. You foreigners, you will never understand Chinese culture. So it's like, it's a brand. The opaqueness and the mysteriousness, it's like China has bought into the going opinion in the West that like, oh, Chinese is so difficult and China is so exotic and it's so mysterious and so long lasting that we can never possibly comprehend it. And Chinese government a lot of Chinese people kind of took this idea and ran away with it. And they just project this idea that like, yeah, we are just too complex for everyone else. And that makes foreigners feel like maybe they are right. They clearly know what they are talking about. I will always be a foreigner in this culture. Whereas if you look at American culture, I can see Yanyi, you want to reply to that. And it needs
Let me bring in Yanyi at this point. Yanyi.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Aga a question. As a Chinese speaker, like not a native Chinese speaker, but a Chinese speaker nonetheless, do you feel welcome when you speak Mandarin?
Yes, I do feel very welcome. It's, it can be funny because people will just assume that as a white person, you cannot speak Mandarin, so they will talk about you in front of you, just assuming that you don't understand. Then the second you open your mouth, they are like, ooh, very surprised, usually very happy, because it's just not something that they get to interact with a lot. And I remember meeting somewhere in Chengdu a young Chinese journalist, and she was so happy to see a foreign person that spoke Chinese, because she said, I don't speak English, so I've never been able to speak to a foreigner before. And it was a very nice experience.
Okay, so I want to bring you to this idea of what would make someone learn. Now, some situations in life force us to learn a new language. Others lure us in through passion and fascination, as we've been talking about. Now, Barbara Serra was the first non-native English speaker to present a primetime news program on British television. Her first language is Italian. And we asked her, what would inspire someone to pick up a foreign language?
I think there's two reasons why people would learn a second or third language. One is love, and the other one is need. So I'm Italian, so I'm going to start with love. I'll give you an example of my little cousin who is 20 years old. She's in Sicily, no link to South Korea at all, genuinely considering doing a course in South Korean at the University of Rome, right? Because she is fascinated by the culture, she loves K-pop, obviously, she loves the cinema, she just finds it fascinating, wants to find out more about it, and that is her link. Now, that's one kind of love. We all know other people that choose to move to a different part of the world, so that's that kind of love. And I think that can be a solid reason, because let's not forget, it's not easy learning a second language. It's not easy learning a second language to the level where it's useful, right? Let alone having to work on it. So if the one choice is love, then the other one is need. You know, why do you learn a second language? Because you have to. Where are you going to go in the world if you don't speak English?
So we've established that Mandarin is unlikely to become lingua franca. But would it become maybe a second language of choice after English? Does it have enough, is there enough love for it yet in the world, as Barbara spoke about, Aga?
I am actually very happy that Barbara mentioned South Korea, because this is a very good example. I can also see it in my environment. My niece is currently in love with South Korea, also because of K-pop. And this is something that a year ago she hadn't even heard about it. So South Korea is a very good example of a country that made the most of what it had. Like, the K-pop industry in South Korea was supported by the government and by the cultural ministry. It was a conscious strategy, and yet there's enough freedom there for it to be allowed to flourish internationally, sort of organically. So it's not like young people around the world, I feel like they don't have the impression that someone is force-feeding them, like, look at this great South Korean culture. No, they see this thing and they like it, and they make the decision that, oh, Korean might be an interesting language to learn. So this is what I would like to see more in terms of Mandarin language. And I think China is not going to do it right now, because China is politically not in a place where that's going to happen, and they are going to push. Like, I remember a few years ago an article where on BBC, I think, where China said, we are going to produce the next international pop star. Like, they think that they can just manufacture it. It's not the way it happens. It needs to be supported, but it needs to be organic to a level. And I think this is where Taiwan has its great opportunity to present itself as something that is inviting. But as Jenny said, Taiwan needs to make a little bit more effort to just let people know that it's there. Like, people don't go to Taiwan to learn Mandarin unless they already know that Taiwan exists. And a lot of people abroad don't know that Taiwan exists still. You have to show them.
Right, Yanyi, let me bring you in at this point. I think you want to jump in here?
Yes.
Yeah.
So about K-pop, and the same applies to Japan as well. There's quite a lot of soft culture, soft power going there.
Yeah.
That is inviting people to learn Korean and Japanese. Now, if we look at China, if you ask any random person on the street in London, nobody's going to really be able to tell you the name of one single pop star in China. And that's because I guess pop culture and soft power isn't really China's strong focus yet. So I completely agree with you, Aga. And I feel that when it comes to Mandopop, Taiwan is definitely a lot stronger than China in this regard. But Mandopop is still not internationally recognized enough. I mean, it is internationally recognized in, I guess, Southeast Asia, but it doesn't spread so much into, like, let's say, Western Europe or Africa or Latin America.
Yanyi and Aga, we still have so much to talk about, but I'm glad you brought up music because to round out today's discussion on language, we asked the Taiwan-based bilingual hip-hop artist his take on English and Mandarin as international languages. Take it away, Anders Saucy.
Yo. Anders Saucy. What comes to mind when you think about English? Is it just another class to pass in your school's curriculum? Sure, it would be nice to learn, but maybe it's not needed. It could very well be Taiwan's linguistic antecedent. What I mean is, you might be perceived as conceited when you speak. A language that which you flex and believe is what exemplifies intelligence. But that's irrelevant. The true purpose of a language is for us to connect. Grew up in the US, they told me watching TV makes you dumb. But in Taiwan, that's called making learning English fun. It's what makes you look smarter, a sign you work harder. It's the key to be a part of a world getting smaller. But is that really the case? I wouldn't close it so soon. Gotta think about the place before you know what words to choose. Example, I have a handful of words at my disposal, but with no receiving ears, well, that's disposal. 在台湾学习英文很重要，但却也会造成人家过于骄傲。在台湾学习英文很重要，但却也会造成人家过于骄傲。
Aga and Yanyi, there's still so much to talk about. We didn't even get to writing Chinese language alphabet characters. But thank you so much for your time. Aga Walulik, Li Yanyi in Taipei. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time. And of course, to our viewers, it's been great to have your company. Remember, if you'd like to see full versions of the videos we played during the show, you can always visit our YouTube channel. And until we have your phone app, do check out our website at TaiwanPlus.com. I'm Divya Gopalan. Stay connected.